Hey everybody, and welcome to week 3. As always, I hope you are finding the content that we're covering enriching and exciting and engaging and overall enjoyable. That's the idea, of course. So hopefully that will hold true for this week as well. Up to this point, we've been sort of telling a sort of protracted story, and we've been moving somewhat chronological throughout U.S. history. But this week, we're going to become more topical in our approach because there are many different developments going on throughout the United States during the 19th century before the Civil War. And so we have to pause for a moment on the timeline and stop progressing forward. And what we have to do is we have to start moving up and down that timeline to talk and look at a number of different developments politically, socially, religiously, culturally, that are transforming the United States during this period. And so this week we're going to be looking at 4 or 5 different topics. And these topics would include the presidency of Andrew Jackson and the development and formation of Jacksonian democracy. We're going to be taking a look at a concept known as manifest destiny and America's westward expansion. We're going to be taking a look at a number of antebellum reform movements. Antebellum is a fun, fancy word which means before the Civil War. Many of these reform movements include things like women's rights, asylum reform, the temperance movement, and of course, perhaps the most prominent of them all, that being abolitionism. All of these, of course, are rooted in a religious movement known as the Second Great Awakening, so we'll look at that. And then finally, following the War of 1812, we also find that the United States begins to develop along industrializing and becoming a nation of manufacturing. And this is predominantly true in the American Northeast. And so we'll be focusing on that as well. So lots of different topics. And so there's a lot of clips that I'm going to be having you look at this week. And there's not any one particular story that we're going to be looking at. Again, it's going to be topical. So, for example, one of the things that we're going to be assessing this week is going to be manifest destiny. Now, manifest destiny is a concept that really had already begun in the United States. It just wasn't given the term manifest destiny until the 1840s by a gentleman named John O'Sullivan. And basically, on its face, the concept of manifest destiny is this idea that the United States and its institutions, and this would include schools and technology and religion, among other things, that the United States had a providential destiny, that is, God ordained. And this is rooted in a concept of American exceptionalism. The idea that God ordained and selected for the United States to overspread the American hemisphere, and specifically the North American hemisphere. You can sort of already see this concept of American exceptionalism rooted in the Monroe Doctrine, where, of course, the United States tells the rest of the world, predominantly Europe, that we will be the police force of the American hemisphere. And so rooted in this concept of manifest destiny is the idea that American ways are exceptional, perhaps better. And there are a number of catalysts for justifying manifest destiny. There's obviously the notion that the Native Americans are heathens and barbarians and backwards, and allegedly they are uncivilized. And so we need to bring American institutions and uplift them and Christianize them. And there's also racial ideas that the United States and its ways are superior and better than other groups of people, and not just Native Americans, but also Mexicans as well. Indeed, the quest for land and the desire by the United States to obtain land is rooted in the concept that multiple people are not as deserving of that land, and this includes Mexicans in addition to Native Americans. It's why we will eventually go to war against Mexico in 1846 in the Mexican-American War. James K. Polk, who will become president of the United States, is very desirous to expand the American empire. And although we attempt to purchase land from Mexico, they say no. So we will go to war. In fact, there's multiple ways that you can obtain land. We've seen that you can purchase it. We've seen that with the Louisiana Purchase. You can make treaties with Native Americans. William Henry Harrison had done this multiple times along the American frontier. When those ways fail, you can then just take it. That's what you will see us do with the Mexican-American War. Many people assume, and perhaps rightly assume, that James K. Polk orchestrated the Mexican-American War. And in the end, with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we acquire a great number of new territories, including California and portions of Arizona and others. And what's interesting, of course, is that gold will be discovered in California in 1848, just 9 days before the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed, which grants the United States access to California. But pay attention to the film and your reading this week on Manifest Destiny, because in many ways this idea of moving west serves as a catalyst for the coming of the American Civil War. Because as we move west, multiple discussions and debates and arguments and outright violence is going to erupt over the spreading of slavery and the westward expansion of slavery. And we'll be talking a lot more about that next week. But that's one topic that we're going to be looking at. Another topic that we're going to be looking at is going to be antebellum reform movements. And at the heart of these movements stood a evangelical Christian sort of emphasis, okay? During the 19th century, before the Civil War, there was a movement known as millennialism, this idea that people wanted the second reign of Jesus Christ to come and he would rule for 1,000 years, as the Bible talks about. And they believed that this could be done if humans could make earth like it is in heaven, which is sort of a biblical sort of comment made in the Bible, on earth as it is in heaven, right? And so folks began to look at human society and they began to point out the sins and the immoralities and the problems that they saw. And they thought, if we could just simply perfect human society, that is, make humans perfect, and get to a point where they sin no longer, then this millennial reign can happen. And these ideas are rooted in an evangelical movement known as the Second Great Awakening, which is not necessarily dissimilar to the First Great Awakening, which we spoke about earlier in the year, or in this course. We have a film this week by Tom Ritchie who's going to provide you some historical context by reviewing the First Great Awakening, but then he's going to get into the Second Great Awakening. But the key message by numerous preachers, and there were quite a few preachers. Lyman Beecher comes to mind. Granderson Finney comes to mind. But even though they have different perspectives on certain things, the message that they're preaching is very, very similar in the sense that that is, we can choose our salvation. We can choose our path. And this really gives way to a lot of revivalist movements. You begin to see camp meetings take place, a lot of emotional conversions, preachings going on and on and on. And they take place in two different locations within the New England area. And the New England Second Great Awakening tends to be more structured, more traditional, while the ones on the American frontier tend to be more based in emotionalism. Indeed, the preachers who are preaching in the American frontier at these camp meetings, for example, support things that were very radical at the time. This would include women preaching, for example. But the reform impulse is going to be motivated to a large extent by this Second Great Awakening, this desire to perfect human society. And so people, and again, largely women, albeit not only women, and not only white people, by the way, there are others, but folks begin to look at society and they say things like, drinking has become a problem. And so what we want to do is to temper the drinking habits of various people. To temper means to reduce. Some folks, of course, went downright to abstinence, that we're just not going to drink at all. Now, you may or may not be aware of this, but prohibition of alcohol does not come to an existence until the 1900s. And so they're not successful. That is, the temperance movement isn't successful in completely abolishing drinking, but they definitely see drinking as a social problem, particularly when husbands are the ones supposed to bring home all the money. They have legal control over their families, and if they spend all their money at the saloon, get drunk, come home, rape their wives, beat their family, what have you, there's really no recourse for women or families to address these issues, and so there's a movement to temper that. There's also a movement towards abolition, and we have a film on abolitionism this week. Of course, this is the movement to abolish slavery. A number of folks, such as William Lloyd Garrison, call for immediate abolitionism. And immediate abolitionism doesn't necessarily mean that, it's Sunday and we have slavery and it's Monday and we don't. It simply means let's immediately begin the process of trying to end the institution of slavery. And both white and black people spoke out about abolition, and they didn't all have the same perspectives about what African Americans should do. You have some folks like Frederick Douglass, who really appeals in many of his writings to the American Enlightenment sense of equality, right? And the idea that whites and blacks could get along with one another. Then you look at someone like David Walker, who outright calls for rebellion and revolt and points to the Haitian Revolution and really encourages African Americans in the South, both free and slave, to rise up in rebellion and revolt against the institution of slavery. You have other African Americans. Martin Delany comes to mind, who encourages folks to leave the United States and flee to Canada or to other areas, knowing or believing that they couldn't get equal treatment in the United States. And so abolitionism is another particular movement. And this is important because when the abolitionists begin to speak in print literature, they really begin to pitch slavery in a new light, and a light that isn't just looking at slavery in terms of political or cultural or social practices. It now takes a look at slavery in terms of its morality. And as John Brown, we'll talk about him next week, as John Brown would argue, slavery is sin, and those who practice it are sinners, and it needed to be dealt with. So that's a reform movement. We're also going to take a look at the women's rights movement, and the women's rights movement was actually born out of many other reform movements. As women sort of took the center stage of many of these reform movements, they began to recognize that they themselves were placed in a condition of servitude. In fact, many women would argue that like slaves, they themselves were slaves to a patriarchal society, and that really encourages the women's rights movement. You get characters such as Angelina Gremke and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The very first women's rights conference is held at the Seneca Falls in New York, and they issued the Declaration of Sentiments. So lots of reform movements that we will talk about this week. I didn't mention all of them, but we'll get more detailed throughout the lecture. So that's another topic we're going to look at this week. In addition to that, we're also going to take a look at President Andrew Jackson's presidential administration and the development and formation of Jacksonian democracy. There is a great political shift that happens during the 19th century, in large part because the political sphere becomes more democratic. And the reason for that is because more people, and predominantly this is white men, more white men are able to participate in the political system because the restrictions that once existed, which limited who could vote, begin to drop away. That is, property restrictions begin to disappear. And so more men who don't necessarily have lots of property are now able to participate in the democratic process. And they do engage in this process. And so there's a real shift among kind of the old notions of politicians who were very fearful of widespread democracy. And then by the time Andrew Jackson becomes president, that has begun to change. Now, one of the things you're going to note is there are two elections you want to pay attention to, and that is the election of 1824 and the election of 1828. The election of 1828 is understood and regarded as kind of a watershed moment in American political history. It's considered by many to be the first modern election, the first modern campaign. Here you find public opinion polls are taken. You find large-scale campaigning. You see the use of mudslinging, that is defaming your opponent and their character, as opposed to looking at their positions and their stance on various issues. And Jackson's administration is so significant and so influential that he has a particular period of history referred to as the Jacksonian era. And so there are 4 videos that we're going to be looking at this week, in addition to your reading, that really highlight and define and trace the development of Jacksonianism. And they do this in part by looking at some of the key events that took place during his presidency, including the War on the Bank, which you'll want to focus on and pay attention to, as well as the nullification crisis. And the nullification crisis is important not only because of what it was itself, but it also indicates that there might be there might be more going on which might cause the Civil War than just the institution of slavery, because as you'll see during the nullification crisis, South Carolina will threaten to secede not because of slavery, but because of something known as protective tariffs. And protective tariffs were implemented because the United States began a process of manufacturing and industrialization, which is a nice transition because that's the last thing that we're going to be looking at this week. Besides slavery itself, we will be looking at slavery and the transatlantic slave trade and the development and formation of slavery in the United States. So that's another topic we'll be looking at. But the United States in the post-war 1812 era really began a process of manufacturing and industrialization. And what's interesting is that this has a very significant impact upon slavery, and you might not think it would, but it does. And the reason for it is because the North and the South's economy, although they're beginning to develop along very different lines, right? The North becomes an industrializing manufacturing center, and the South retains its agricultural slave-based economy. But the two are intricately connected, and the reason for that is because the South grows cotton, but it doesn't have manufacturing centers. It has to take that cotton and ship it either to outside sources, such as England, or as frequently happened, they would ship it from the South, send it to the American North, where textile factories, such as the one that developed in Lowell, Massachusetts, we'll be talking about that, and they would then take that raw cotton and turn it into a final product, and quite often then sell those products back to the South. And the reason why protective tariffs get put into place is because American industry is in its infant stages, and it's having a difficult time competing with England, who had already begun to manufacture and become an industrializing giant. But because we went to war with them in 1812, England cut off trade with the United States, and so we were really forced to industrialize on our own, and that's exactly what we're going to do. And during the market revolution, as it's oftentimes referred to, the United States is going to begin a process of innovation, and we're going to invent a number of different things, including the cotton gin, which will revolutionize cotton production and really breathe fire into the life of slavery in the South. But we also see transportation developments and telecommunication technology, such as the telegraph and the railroad and the building of Erie Canal and other canals. And all of this is to facilitate industrialization and growth. And in this time, women were able to obtain jobs in ways that they had never been able to before. This is particularly true in Lowell's factory. These girls were hired on because, one, there was a plethora of them in New England, because many men had left to go west on their manifest destiny, and there was a number of these ladies left over from small farms. But two, because they were women, you could pay them less, and they were paid less, and so they were brought in. Over time, these women struck, and they decided this wasn't what they wanted to do. That's an oversimplification, but we'll get more in detail throughout the lecture. And in the end, they will be replaced by immigrant labor. As these two regions, the North and South, develop differently with respects to their economies, one has to beg the question, can these two economies coexist harmoniously forever? Perhaps not. And in the end, when we take a look at what's going on during this period, we have to immediately begin to put our mind towards the Civil War. Because when we think about abolitionism, the westward expansion of slavery, protective tariffs, and two different economies beginning to compete with one another, and a host of other things, reform movements, right? All of this is going to come together to create a great deal of tension. And as we'll see next week, the Civil War was on the horizon. So that's what I got for you this week. If you have questions, contact me. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Otherwise, get your reading done, get your watching done, get your questions done, and get those submitted. So, as always, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, live long and prosper, and may the odds forever be in your favor. Have a blessed week, guys.